on not just orchestral music, but how it relates to non-ephemeral works, works which actually have the possibility of lasting. Are there more people now? And we go back to the time of Gershwin, but actually we go back further than that, because from Bach on, they were always using the music of their time. And do you feel connected to the past when either of you do it, or does it feel like a new world for you?
You know, for me, I always felt that that being a composer for me involved absorbing everything that was part of my world and what I loved. At first, in my 20s, I wasn't really so much thinking about popular culture or the music that I actually grew up with. I almost saw them as separate, but as I got older, I saw the distinctions really begin to evaporate. And I began to realize that the music that I had listened to for so many years wasn't always concert music or classical music, but was a lot of the popular music that was actually having its heyday in the 60s and 70s, which young kids are now listening to as if it just came off the presses, you know. And to me, it's just, you know, more and more as time goes by, I see that that this is, you know, composers have been doing this. I mean, you know, Haydn and Bartok and everybody. But the turning point for me came when I went for my first visit to a cardiologist of all people, who said to me, when he found out what I did for a living, he said, "I hope you'll never stray too far from the folk music of your culture, because when you do that, music dies." He said, your music will live if you're always connected to the music of your own culture. And I think he's right.
That's a really perceptive thing for a non-musician to say. I mean, I found that the real magical moments are when something like, you know, a popular tune or some kind of popular rhythm is incorporated into the composer's language and comes out in an individual way, with fingerprints on that. And that's one thing that Richard does so beautifully, synthesizing various kinds of music, but always having it become in his style. And I think that that's one of the things that's tough, because, you know, if you're in the concert hall and you hear what is basically just a straight ahead importation from some other world, then it doesn't really necessarily move you in the way that, say, you know, Gershwin really cross-pollinates. You know, what is the difference between crossover and really cross-pollinating and something deeper than just sort of skating on the surface? And I found that, you know, if obviously you look at somebody like Gershwin, you really do find them over a course of time, that they really do have a way of synthesizing in a way that is completely individual. And certainly with the Liquid Interface, it has, you know, there's this sort of swing and Dixieland element to it, but also the electronica element. And I ultimately want to end up on the third planet, and not just kind of have one sort of brought into the other.
Actually, what struck me as I was doing the program all week and putting it together is never once did I feel any composer was out of their element, which I feel with some people is really true, that none of you have moved into an area where you're not doing something that feels forced, that feels very natural. So I guess the next question would be, at what point do you say, well, I can't do that? If somebody came to you, here's the libretto, here's a song cycle, here's an idea, is there a point when you go, I don't think this is for me?
It's a great question, because it really ties into what Mason was saying. I think, you know, appropriating music or quoting it can only work if there's a way to organically convert it through the filter of one's own personality. And I think there are ideas that work for us as composers, that, you know, we say, well, I can do that because I see a way. And for instance, you know, with the quote that was at the end of Pastime, of the few bars of the Star Spangled Banner, I could never do that unless it was connected to so much of the material that had existed. And if you can find a way to make that work, sometimes this stuff evolves. You hear the Star Spangled Banner in the piece, and then you say, oh, well, this has to come out now. Or sometimes you think, well, wouldn't it be great if we could use this, or we could quote this now? How does this relate, or does it? So the answer is, if it's not really organically woven, and even we're talking about vernacular ideas, if it can't be organically woven into, say, the use of the text, or the use, or the general gestalt of the piece, then that's, I think, when I say I can't do it.
And one of the things that I've noticed when I move around different musical spaces is the psychology really changes the way you hear music in different spaces, which, you know, might not be a revelation to most of y'all, but it kind of was to me when I was starting to spin records and DJing. I realized that my musical perception was so different in a space where you're absolutely focused on the piece and the way you want the concert hall. So, for example, sometimes folks, friends of mine might think that they're going to hear a straight-ahead techno track with like real strings instead of synthetic strings and just kind of wholesale importation, and really that to me doesn't work. It can't work. It has to somehow engage me in a way that is going to be appropriate for the space. And for me, that is absolutely the number one thing I think about when I'm working with the material that might be a little bit further afield.
Anybody else have no idea what a wholesale techno track is? One last thing on this, and we'll just switch to something else. Reaching back and using other materials seems to me perhaps to have a time limit, because I can't imagine 40 years from now, people are quoting the Black Eyed Peas or most of the music we have today. It just doesn't seem stylistically that we're going to be able to do that. That we usually kind of stop with jazz and some Broadway things, and then we don't go near what we hear now. You're the closest so far, but it's more the sounds than the music itself.
Well, there are, I mean, the rhythms of techno or electronica really are today's dance rhythms. It's what you might associate with clubs, but people generally make it in car commercials or something like that. But you know, there is a world there. The reason I find electronica to be a particularly rich world is because by not having a vocal element, unlike a lot of pop music, the rhythms become quite intricate. The harmonies are really interesting, and the textures kind of have to bump up in interest because you don't have the ear drawn to the vocal line. So I do find that there are things today. It's not the Black Eyed Peas, but it's definitely there are things that are happening.
Pastime is a really interesting idea, because there are few pieces that deal with an actual sport like baseball. And I think Koniger had rugby, if I remember correctly. There's no football piece that I know. Well, there's a Harvard-Yale-Princeton football game, whatever.
There's a tennis piece.
There's a tennis piece.
Debussy.
Oh yeah, of course. That's right. So the piece we heard earlier this year of yours, that Angela sang, there are stylistic similarities.
Well, they were written as a kind of brother-sister cycle. I almost saw them as sort of two, if we were dealing with LPs, they would be two sides of the same album, and I really thought of them almost as companions to go together. And one of the things, though, that I was very conscious of with Pastime, which is different from A Woman's Life, is that I thought, if I could invoke some of the jazz that was being played at the time that these ball players were in their heyday, that it would, in some way that was almost subliminal, create a kind of atmosphere for who they were, or where they were at the time.